Good morning. I'm Carlin Bowman, and I want to thank you all for coming out on this very rainy morning to inaugurate the 20th season of AEI's Election Watch program. This is the longest-running election analysis program in Washington, having begun in 1982. We have a lot of ground to cover, so we want to get started. But first, I'd like to thank Jackie Clements and the AEI events team for all the work that they do to put these programs together. I think you know our panelists, my colleagues Nora Mornstein and Michael Barone from AEI, our former colleagues, John Fortier, now at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Henry Olson from the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Each of my colleagues will make introductory remarks of about 7 minutes. I know all of them have strong opinions about the Democratic nomination contest as March Madness begins next week, but I've asked them to begin their remarks by discussing some things that aren't getting as much attention right now. The Senate contests, the governor's races, the state of the two parties, and the House contest. Then we'll have time to discuss the nomination. Before beginning, let me say a word, as I usually do in these sessions, about the national mood. Donald Trump's approval rating in recent polls has been inching up. He's now hit 49% in the two most recent Gallup polls of adults. There's several possible explanations. First, we've had 4 polls in the last month that show confidence in the U.S. economy at the highest point in 20 years. In several polls, people are saying that their personal prospects are at an all-time high. Majorities approve of the job that Trump is doing handling the economy and separately jobs. Of course, all bets are off if we have another day or two like yesterday when the Dow Jones plunged, gold prices rose, and oil prices plummeted. When people are confident about their personal situations, perhaps paradoxically, they're often more generous about what they want governments to do. This may explain support for some of the Democrats' more expansive social programs. Another possible explanation for Trump's slight rise takes us back to something we saw after the Clinton impeachment. People wanted it to be over. Impeachment changed very little, if anything, in the contours of public opinion, but the already high support for President Clinton inched up in a number of polls. In both cases, the good news for the president's party may have caused more of the president's party's supporters to take surveys. Finally, the arguments among Democratic contenders don't help the Democrats. 65% of registered voters nationwide in a new CBS News Battleground poll said Trump would probably or definitely be reelected, including more than a third of Democrats. In the new Morning Consult poll yesterday, a 46% plurality gave that response. At the same time, Morning Consult and other recent polls also suggested that rank-and-file Democrats are coming to terms with Bernie Sanders and feel that he could beat Trump in November. The head-to-head matchups in most polls show a tight race no matter who the Democratic nominee is. As CBS pointed out, voters are dug in. When asked how much their vote in November depended on the Democratic nominee in this new poll, 63% of general elections, 63% in the CBS survey said it didn't matter who the Democratic nominee was. In another question, 61% said that what Trump may do over the next year didn't matter to them. Only 101 delegates have been selected thus far. On Super Tuesday, slightly more than a third of all delegates will be chosen, including the largest delegate-rich states in California, 415 delegates, and Texas, 228. Of course, 1,990 are needed to win the nomination. By the end of March Madness, more than 60% of the delegates will be selected. As the invaluable Ballotpedia pointed out this morning, there are 869 elections on March 3rd, including 30 battleground primaries in four states. With that overview, let me turn to our panelists. We will start with Michael Barone, the author of the new book, How America's Political Parties Change and How They Don't. Michael, how does the Senate landscape look at this point? And give us some historical context. Can the GOP hold the Senate? How much does the person at the top of the ticket matter, or are these races usually about the individual candidates? Michael.
Well, if we were talking back in 1982, we would probably say that the Senate races were mostly about the individual candidates. Increasingly, Americans have been voting straight party tickets in this century, and really starting in the 1990s. And so I think the basic overall trends are there. Are in line with national partisan trends, and the vote in the Trump-Clinton race in 2016 can be used as a kind of index of where people are, with an eye out for also the Democrats rallying and success in the 2018 races for House of Representatives. It's the Senate. The Senate, small number of Senate seats, often decided by very small numbers, can make a big difference in governance. A Senate with, if we have a Senate with 50 Republicans cooperating with a re-elected President Donald Trump, you're going to see a continued number of federal judges and perhaps Supreme Court justices replaced and confirmed. If you have a Senate with 50 Democrats and a newly elected Democratic president, we're also going to see a lot of judicial appointees, I think, but the numbers are going to be very different. Given the change in rules put through initially by the political philosopher Harry Reid and continued by and widened by the political philosopher Mitch McConnell, 50 votes confirms judges these days. And a very small number of popular votes can make a difference. It's not because Republicans have an advantage from their domination of small states. The 10 largest states have 10 Democratic and 10 Republican senators. The 10 smallest states in population have 10 Republican and 10 Democratic senators, including Bernie Sanders. It's the states in the middle that make the difference. Republicans are on the defensive in Senate races. They're defending 23 seats, the Democrats only 12. And most of those seats are counted as safe for the current parties. But with straight ticket voting, there are probably going to be some changes. The seat in greatest jeopardy of changing hands is probably the Alabama seat won in a special election by Democrat Doug Jones by a 50 to 48 margin over the Republican, may I say, eccentric Republican Roy Moore. Senator Jones can claim to have to be a competent person who has served honorably. He's also had a strong liberal voting record in the state that went for Trump over Clinton by 28 points. Current polling shows him doing better than the average Democrat, but not well enough to win. While Roy Moore is running again, but the last poll I saw showed him getting 5% in the Republican primary. So unless there's a huge number of votes somehow nominating Roy Moore, I think that Jeff Sessions or the Republican nominee, he's got competition, are the favorites to win these seats. Hard to see where Republicans make further gains. I think the likeliest possibility is in Michigan, my home state, narrowly carried by Donald Trump to the surprise of almost everybody. One-term Democratic incumbent Gary Peters seems to have the lowest name identification of any incumbent senator, and the Republican challenger John James, who held three-term Democrat Debbie Stabenow to a 6-point win 2 years ago, is running a vigorous campaign. So that's a possible turnover. And, you know, if you look at the Cook Political Report, that they rate that as lean Democratic. They've got a couple more races in Minnesota and New Mexico as likely Democratic, which is more likely than lean. Minnesota was a 1.5-point Clinton state, less than expected. If you look at New Mexico, the combined vote for Trump and the Libertarian Gary Johnson, who's former governor there, was 1 point ahead of Clinton. You may have a race in New Hampshire, which was a 1-point Trump loss in 2016. But has always been closely divided in the Senate races, but those look like long shots. The question then is, assuming Alabama puts the Republicans up 54-46, can the Democrats win enough seats to get 50 or 51 seats, which they would need, depending on who wins the presidential election, for a majority? One place they're looking for that is in Maine, where Susan Collins's votes for Justice Brett Kavanaugh and against removing Trump have given her spirited opposition, and she's not likely to duplicate her previous lopsided margins. But that was just a 3-point Clinton state in 2016. Maine split from Massachusetts in 1820, and it's not a part of Massachusetts anymore. 2 western and 2 southern states carried easily by George W. Bush back in 2004, which doesn't seem so long ago to me, but perhaps it does for many in the audience, are now marginal in presidential races, and Republican senators are threatened. Cory Gardner was a 2-point winner in 2014 in Colorado. That was a 5-point Clinton state. He's obviously at risk to former Governor John Hickenlooper or others. Martha McSally lost by 2 points in Arizona to 2018. She was then appointed to fill the late John McCain's seat. She's been narrowly trailing Democrat Mark Kelly. Georgia's fast-growing black population has made that state more marginal. It was a 5-point Trump state. Republican appointee Kelly Loeffler to Johnny Isaacson seat may be pressed to hold on to that seat. North Carolina, with pretty similar demographics, was a 4-point Trump state. Republican Tom Tillis, with low substantive identification, has serious opposition. I would add a note of caution for Democrats, however, because in all 4 states, Democrats have benefited, have become more competitive in presidential races than they were, say, in 2004, from increasing support from affluent white college grads. This is a group that Donald Trump has done poorly with, much more so than with other voters. This is a group from which Democrats won, the House seat in Georgia's 6th, for example, the North Atlanta suburbs, which is the 6th most high education district in the country, had been heavily Republican, elected a Democrat. So Democrats depend on those white college grads in this kind of environment to carry those states or to come win elections in those states. There are signs that those voters might be repelled by the party's likely presidential nominee, Bernie Sanders. But Carolyn has informed me that I am treading on dangerous ground when I speculate on the presidential race, so I'll end here.
Thanks, Michael. We're now going to turn to John Fortier. AEI is soon going to publish the 4th edition of an invaluable primer, After the People Vote, edited by John. It explains how the Electoral College works, and it offers arguments both for and against it. It includes a chapter written by Norm on contested elections. John is also one of the country's leading experts on early and absentee voting, having authored an AEI book on the subject in 2006. 10 of the Super Tuesday states, including delegate-rich California and Texas, have already started voting. In Nevada, it looks like about 70% of caucus voters voted early. I've asked John to talk about the governor's contest, and you can follow along with the handouts at your table, and also to provide some insights on electoral processes this year. John.
Thank you, Carolyn. And Carolyn was too modest to mention that Carolyn actually has a new chapter in this After the People Vote on public opinion on the Electoral College. And if you know Carolyn's work, of course, there's no one better to have really surveyed the last 50 years or so of what people think about the Electoral College. So coming soon. So I'm going to talk about the governors and a little bit about rules and especially election administration early voting rules. First, the governors you have in your handout, the landscape is it's a little more closely divided between Republicans and Democrats than it was. In the Obama administration, Republicans had reached a high water mark of in the mid to high 30s of holding governorships. It's divided 27 Republicans to 23 Democrats today. And of those states, Democrats hold 8 that are in Trump-won states, 4 of them big Trump-win states, Montana, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Kansas, and 4 closer states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. And Republicans hold 4 states that Hillary Clinton won, and again, 3 of those are big Democratic states, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maryland, and then New Hampshire, a swing state. So this is the small class of governors. In a way, it's the less exciting class than the midterms. There are only 11 governorships up, 7 of them held by Republicans, 4 by Democrats. And they're also smaller states, many of them, not all, but smaller states, at least the more competitive ones, which I'll quickly mention the impact on redistricting, which is probably not so much from the governor's races, perhaps from some state legislative races, one last cycle before we hit redistricting. Of the competitive races, I think really we want to look at Montana as the top of the list. Montana, a state that voted 20 points for Donald Trump, but has been held, the governorship has been held by Democrats for quite some time. Steve Bullock, a short-time presidential candidate, term limited out of his seat. So it's an open seat, but it's an interesting competitive seat with actually an interesting primary on the Republican side. North Carolina, a state which Democrats hold, Roy Cooper, I think a state that probably still leans to Roy Cooper retaining that seat, but nonetheless a very competitive state, and one that, interestingly, I think people are really going to be looking at in the redistricting contest. But one interesting fact is that the North Carolina governor has no role in redistricting, so it is purely a state legislative matter as we get to that. I mentioned 3 others, which are a little more, they're somewhat safe on the Republican side, but they're lean Republicans. Those would be West Virginia, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Again, Vermont being a very Democratic state, with Phil Scott running on a 2-year term. One interesting note is that if Scott does not get a pure majority, just gets a plurality, that governorship race, that gubernatorial race, goes to the state legislature. That's happened many times in Vermont. Very rarely has the plurality winner been denied the possibility, but I guess in today's climate, that is a possibility, although I think he is still favored. New Hampshire with Chris Sununu and West Virginia with Jim Justice potentially have races, but I think they're probably leaning in the Republican direction. My second point, which is on rules, but leads into more election administration rules, is just briefly to touch on the primary race. Just want to make the point about the threshold in the Democratic Party rules of 15%. The reason I make that point is we hear a lot of talk about potentially there being a divided convention or the race going to the convention because of all the candidates splitting their votes in many ways. It is true that we have a number of candidates who might get a good number of votes, popular votes, but that 15% threshold is, by one scenario, I think could be very, very good for Bernie Sanders, or also make it very difficult for more than a few candidates to emerge out of this. Take, for example, the Real Clear Politics national average from the polls. I haven't seen this morning's polls, but just with Bernie Sanders at 19%, Biden at 17%, Bloomberg at 15%, Warren at 13%, Buttigieg 10%, Klobuchar 6%. You can see how Biden and Bloomberg are close to the edge. And again, this is going to differ by state, also with congressional districts within the state. But if you have a thought exercise where you say Bernie Sanders does well into the 20s, and the other candidates are all kind of grouped around 10 to 15%, sometimes making it in. I mean, literally, if they were all below 15%, Bernie Sanders would get 100% of the delegates. That's not going to happen, but he certainly leads in many states and districts and also is likely to make the threshold in almost all places, and therefore is a likely getter of delegates in places where others are sometimes getting them and sometimes not. I won't talk about it too much, but a 2-candidate scenario where either Biden or Bloomberg perhaps emerges more strongly, that might be more of a 2-person race going forward. 3-person race, possible, but again, I think that means that Bloomberg and Biden would be sort of at the bottom of the above the threshold, and therefore probably not picking up as many delegates. So I would watch the 15% threshold. On to early voting, or early voting in election administration. Carlin is right. The trend generally since I wrote this book in 2006 has been more and more and more early voting. And by that, we could mean early voting in person or early voting by mail. Both are up significantly, over 40% of the general electorate in 2016. Why does it matter? One, it has mattered in the caucuses. The caucuses may, on the Democratic side, be not long for this world. Partly there were some problems with technology. Partly the parties running the caucuses versus election officials caused some problems, but partly we were doing some complex things. We were introducing early voting and non-caucus-based voting into this system and trying to combine them. And I think that made it very difficult and caused results to be held back for a while. So I would, watch that as a factor. There are a large number of votes that have already been cast. We don't have the case where there are probably so many cast for a candidate that has dropped out at the last minute here, but on Super Tuesday, there certainly are going to be votes that have already been cast before the debates, before tonight's debate, and maybe for some candidates who are doing less well or perhaps are even off the ballot. And I guess I do want to emphasize both for the general election, but also for the primary elections that we are potentially facing some scenarios where it is going to take a long time to count the votes. In the general election, I think people worry about what if there's a very close race and what about the legitimacy of the race. Here, as contests move from one to the other, we look especially at California, which not only does a lot of vote by mail, but is moving to a new system, has new voting equipment in Los Angeles County, has some different things they're trying to implement. They take a long time to count the vote anyway. And so there's a place I think Bernie Sanders arguably could do very, very well, but maybe we find that we have the election results delayed. And I can't imagine that the Sanders voter, if that's the case, is going to say, look, it happened to me again. It happened in Iowa. It happened a bit in Nevada. But it happened before in Iowa in 2016, that the delays step on the message that I've done very well in California, which I do think he will do very well. So that's one of the factors of early voting.
Thank you very much, John. Everybody's right on time this morning. Now going to turn to Henry Olson. And if you don't read Henry's daily Washington Post columns, you should. Henry is the author of Working Class Republican, Ronald Reagan and the Return of Blue-Collar Conservatism, and The Four Faces of the Republican Party. Henry is the only person on this stage who's actually run for office. I've asked Henry to speak about the state of both political parties and why it matters for November's elections. Henry.
Thank you, Carlin. Thinking about the state of the parties, there's a couple of ways to think about it. One is the parties as a voter base. The second is the relationship between the leaders and the parties. And the third is the parties as a technical election apparatus. I'm going to briefly touch on each. With respect to the election apparatus, the Republican National Committee has always been, in recent times, significantly stronger than the Democratic National Committee. They are raising money hand over fist. The DNC is not as flush with cash as the Republicans are. And the Trump campaign, because it hasn't had to face a serious internal opponent, is already itself flush with cash and is much more technically sophisticated. Of course, it's not hard to be more technically sophisticated than the Trump 2016 campaign, which anyone who was close to it says was not really more of a campaign at all in a traditional sense. It was a candidate flying around holding rallies. But every indication is that the Republicans have sophisticated targeting operations, sophisticated databases, and more than enough money to put into the field. So on that sense, the Republicans at the national level will outpace the Democrats. At the committee level, the Senate and the House committees, the Democrats, however, are doing quite well fundraising. And a lot of the Democratic talent is, on the campaign side, is linked into those committees. So we shouldn't look at the Democrats as having a technical disadvantage for the races for Congress. So in that sense, the state of the parties is relatively healthy. If looking at the question of the voters in the party, Republican voters are relatively unified. The people who did not like the direction the Republican Party was taking are largely no longer Republicans, or if they are, they're Republicans in exile. These are the college-educated, affluent people who voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, voted for Democrats for the House. They were not a huge part of the Republican coalition, which is one reason why they were easily swept aside, but they often had punched above their weight in intra-party disputes and were rather shocked to find how far out of step they were. But the Republican voter base is relatively united, and any disputes that will be coming up between them are being suppressed by the need to reelect the president, and more importantly, for many Republicans, keep the Democrats out. The Democrats facially appear to be divided, but in fact are also, with respect to a bipartisan election, quite united. That if there's one thing that unites the Democrats, it's the need to keep the Republicans out, and particularly defeat that man in the White House. But what we're seeing in the presidential race right now is a lingering divide within the Democrats, and that is the question of whether or not America needs significant change or America needs some form of recalibration. The Democratic elite, the center left of the party, largely believes in the latter, that they are perfectly satisfied with the way that President Obama conducted his administration and would like to see more of the same. And the people who are not are the people who support a man whose PAC was called Our Revolution, which is not terribly subtle. And the polls suggest that people are roughly divided between whether they want the party to move in a more leftward direction or if they want to continue the course. And this is something that the Democratic leadership has tried to avoid confronting, which is understandable, but avoiding confronting that in one sense has given strength to the revolutionaries, that those who want dramatic change are moving ahead because they're not going to wait. They want dramatic change. And rather than mobilize their voters in response to that, what you've seen is a desire not to confront this. And now, with the emergence of Bernie Sanders, you're beginning to see Democratic leaders raise the alarm and say, we can't have a socialist. Well, maybe you should have said that in the preceding years when he was doing what he was doing. Maybe you should have tried to educate your voters. In that sense, they are in the position that Republican elites were in about 6 to 8 years ago, dealing with their group of voters who wanted dramatic change. They also did not mobilize their voters and eventually found that they had to fall in line or fall out of the party. And that gets to my third question, which is the leaders versus the voters. There, we've seen large disconnects. And their disconnects are not dissimilar from the sort of disconnects that we've seen in parties throughout the world, which is that increasingly on left and right, you see people who want radical change from a status quo that had largely defined the Western world from 1988 to 2008. Right-wing populism, for the phrase that's used, wants action in one direction. Left-wing populism, typified by Jeremy Corbyn, or the party that won the latest Irish election, Sinn Féin, wants direction and change in another direction. What they're united about is that the ins, the people who have largely run the bipartisan consensus that have governed the Western world for the 20-year period leading to the great financial crash, should be out. And the leaders of both parties in this country are largely people who don't believe there should be radical change. In the Trump administration, those people have largely fallen in line with Trump, waiting for the day when they can recover. But many in Washington on the Republican side have yet to realize how much their internal desires are out of step with their voter base. And the Democrats are seeing that right now, is that the Democratic establishment here would like to see a more temperate, less radical change than much of the Democratic voter base wants to see. And ultimately, that means that the parties are realigning in ways that will mean new leaders will come to the fore and current leaders will find themselves on the sidelines. And it remains to be seen whether and how this realignment shakes out. But looking at the rest of the world, it appears that it's easier for the right to adjust to its changes than it is for the left. There are very few examples of a strong center-left leader who has managed to recapture the energy of the left, whereas there are many examples of successful center-right leaders who have defused populist anger by adopting some of their policies. And there are examples of center-left leaders who have risen to power by defusing some of the populism, such as in Denmark, and bringing it to their own side. So I think the Democrats have a day of reckoning in the next 4 years, whether Sanders wins or loses, that is long delayed, but will be nonetheless painful to experience now that it's come.
Thank you very much, Henry. And last but not least, my longtime colleague, Norm Ornstein from AEI. Norm and I started this Election Watch program in 1982, and he's been a regular participant in every election cycle since. He's the co-author of the enormously valuable AEI Brookings volume, Vital Statistics on Congress, which is now produced online by Brookings. And he's also the author with a book that just made an enormous impression on me with Tom Mann, The Broken Branch, How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. But more recently, and I want to, just as an aside here, Norm has been the moving force behind a new documentary that will be on PBS on April 14th. The title is The Definition of Insanity. It's not about the election. And it is a documentary about how the criminal justice system has dealt with people with severe mental illness. And I urge you all to tune into that on April 14th on PBS. But now Norm's going to talk about the House races and whether or not the Republicans, they need a net gain of 18 seats, and how well is the GOP positioned for that takeover.
Thanks so much, Carlin. That's April 14th at 10 p.m. Eastern. Today is day 1130 of the Trump presidency, or as he says, longer than any other president. It's also week 166 of Infrastructure Week, and we're waiting eagerly for week 167. Tonight is another debate, and it will be interesting to see if it parallels the last debate, which was directed by Quentin Tarantino. And, of course, the highlight was when Elizabeth Warren jumped off the top rope, body slammed Michael Bloomberg, reached down his throat and pulled out his stents one by one. And the question is whether anybody will do that to Bernie Sanders, understanding that that might be a suicide mission because the reaction of his followers is usually pretty severe. I want to just put one little larger framework here. We're in a time of great uncertainty. It's not just uncertainty in terms of the presidential nomination, but the larger environment we face. There's the impact of Brexit, which is still uncertain, of the trade wars, but now the coronavirus. And I want to, because there's always a tweet for anything, a very interesting tweet from Donald Trump on February 25th of 2015, and I quote, "If the Dow Jones," spelled Joans, "ever falls more than 1,000 points in a single day, the sitting president should be loaded into a very big cannon and shot into the sun at tremendous speed. No excuses!" exclamation point. So the Space Force apparently will have its first mission. But all of that, besides being funny, really tells us that a lot of the factors here that could shape the outcome of the election from top to bottom go beyond who the candidates are, but to that larger environment. And if we end up with very severe economic perturbations, along with a pandemic and a health crisis that could spread quickly across the globe, and no clear sense that we have the best people possible in charge at the CDC or elsewhere to deal with it, that could have a very big impact on the elections. Now, when we look at the House, the Democrats, of course, got a big victory in 2018 and recaptured their majority. And if you look at the Cook Political Report and its ratings, at least at this point, there are 216 Democratic seats that are seen as either safe or pretty close to that. You need 218 to make a majority. The Republicans have 192 in that category, and that leaves 26 seats that are in the toss-up range or maybe even a little bit worse for the parties. And of course, especially because they won significantly the last time, more of those are seats held by Democrats than by Republicans. It's basically about 18-8. And not surprisingly, the Democratic seats that are vulnerable are ones where they took, in many cases with surprise, a Republican seat. That includes one in Oklahoma, Kendra Horn, which was quite astonishing. It includes a Utah seat that Mia Love had held. It includes 3 in Iowa. and also a number of seats in suburban areas, in places like suburban New York with Max Rose, and Michigan with Alyssa Slotkin, and the seat in Maine, Maine's 2nd congressional district, which we will look at with enormous interest, not just because of the question of whether Jared Golden can win re-election, but in an election that could turn out to be very close for the presidency. That could make the difference between a 269-269 electoral split and a 271 victory for a president. And of course, right now, the focus should be on those suburban voters, the ones that Henry mentioned, and a lot more, those who still consider themselves Republicans, but who decided they wanted to check and balance and voted Democratic for House races in places where they had voted Republican for president in the presidential contest. And that's where Democrats are particularly nervous about the impact of Bernie Sanders. There are, for example, at least a couple of seats in southern Florida that are contestable, where Democrats should win, but won't necessarily if Bernie Sanders is the nominee, given his statements about Fidel Castro and the backlash that's already occurred in Florida, including having the Florida Democratic Party distance themselves from him. But also a question of whether those suburban voters will turn out, will vote for a Democratic presidential candidate who they do not see as necessarily in their wheelhouse or interest. And the unease that many Democrats have about what happens in the House is based on that. Now, when you get a wave election, usually the close contests tip overwhelmingly in one direction or another. And a wave election, which is at least possible but not likely, could put that Democratic House majority in jeopardy. At this point, you would say it's not in jeopardy, but the numbers are likely to be reduced a little bit. And what we can also say is the 2018 election dramatically changed the dynamic in the country. When you move to having one House at least that is a check against the president, even if it doesn't result in an enormous change in legislative outcomes, it makes a real difference, especially in this day and age, in terms of investigations, oversight, which is not happening in the other House at all. So whether we have united government or divided government next time is going to have enormous implications for the direction of the country. And given the tribal dynamism in Washington, whether we have any capacity to deal with the problems that we face at home and abroad. So have a nice day.
Thanks very much, Norm. We certainly want to allow enough time for all your questions, and at this point, I'll tell you that we'll be sending save the date cards out for future election watches. We will do what we've always done, and that is 2 days after the election, we'll have a luncheon in which we'll talk about what happened and why, and go forward from there. Again, we're planning the other dates for this year. I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator and ask a few questions, and I want to know what you all think about what should and will happen if Bernie Sanders ends up with a plurality and not a majority of the delegates. Who wants to go first? Michael. Quickly.
I think he will be nominated by the Democratic Party. I suppose you could say it depends on how big the plurality is. If he's got a plurality of 4 delegates over somebody else, that's within the margin of error that we've already seen in the incompetent voting tallies in Iowa and Nevada. But I think that it will be hard for Democrats to do that. When people talk about a brokered convention, and going back to the wonderful good old days, I think one of the things you have to keep in mind is that we can't go back to the old days, because if you're talking 1952 or earlier, that's the last multi-ballot convention, the convention then was a communication device. It was the only place where the politicians actually met in an era when long-distance telephone was not the way most people did business. Very unusual to make long-distance calls. When you got one, the first question was, who died? And when you didn't have jet air travel, people went into the convention not knowing how many delegates people had. the communication that used to go on at the conventions is going on all around us all the time. The air here is thick with it, and every place else in the country and the world. So it's not going to be the same kind of dynamic of waiting for the roll call to be summoned and what's happened in the smoke-filled room. But I think there is the possibility that negotiations will take place. There will be a lot of storm and drang, and often decisions are postponed until deadline. And of course, when the convention meets is the ultimate deadline. So I think we can see some drama, but I think that it's not going to be of the same kind that we saw in conventions like 1924 when the Democrats took 103 ballots to nominate a presidential candidate.
Any dissent or differences?
Well, I would just add, first of all, to reiterate, there are no brokers anymore, and it's not even clear that the candidates control their own delegates. If you had, for example, an Elizabeth Warren say to her block of delegates, if they were there, you're all going to vote for Michael Bloomberg, there would be a revolt. One caveat is it depends on who the alternative is. If Sanders has a plurality against Michael Bloomberg, it'll be a very different dynamic than if it's a plurality where the next closest, and maybe somebody who's relatively close, is a Joe Biden or an Elizabeth Warren or somebody else. Some of this is going to depend on when candidates drop out. And one of the impact, right now we're getting a lot of muddle that is leaving Sanders in a stronger position. Tom Steyer is probably keeping Joe Biden from winning a clear-cut large victory in South Carolina that would slow Sanders' momentum at least a little bit. Amy Klobuchar is likely to stay in at least through Super Tuesday so she can pick up delegates in Minnesota. And the expectation that there might be a convention moving beyond the first ballot is an incentive for candidates to stay in the race so that you've got a piece of the action. Now, at the same time, I think that if Sanders has any kind of a plurality, given the way he behaved in 2016 and the way he's behaving now, which is in effect blackmailing the party. Remember, superdelegates cannot vote on the first ballot, but are free to vote however they wish on the second. And he's railed against those superdelegates. The prospect of a deep split of a Sanders saying, if I'm not the nominee, I'm leaving and taking my people with me, could make this an extremely combustible and destructive convention in Milwaukee.
Henry or John?
I agree. I think it's almost impossible to take it away from a plurality leader. The scenarios you could imagine what could happen would be lots of candidates grouped in a low 20s or 30% range. That's not going to happen. So I think it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, I'd just say what Sanders does for the other races, if he is the nominee, is put strong cross pressures on these non-Democrats or recently arrived Democrats who are clearly not agreeing with virtually any of Sanders' positions but don't like President Trump. And how they decide to vote will determine who the president is and also determine the size of Republican gains in Congress. And it could very well be in 2016 we saw something, the one exception I would say to the straight ticket voting rule is in 2016 we saw a lot of people who voted for Clinton at the top of the ticket but Republican for the House. In 2018 they fell back in line so that they voted Democratic for the House. And I think that was because they were making a strategic choice, is that they expected Hillary to win, they wanted Hillary to win, but they didn't want the Democrats to have full control of the legislative process. And you could see a similar calculation go on here, which is that if they think that Trump is going to win, they'll vote Democratic for the lower races to check him. Because they're divided, that's a way to express that. Or if they think it's a possibility that Sanders will win, they might vote Republican to ensure that he doesn't have a check. So I'd say we'll have to watch this very closely because there could be a lot of undecided voting with respect to the down ballot races if Sanders is the nominee until very late in the race.
I don't want to get too far ahead here, but I wonder if you have any initial thoughts. If Bernie is the nominee, who should his vice president be?
Well, who he will pick will almost certainly be different than who he should pick.
Yeah.
because he should pick somebody to unite the party, but he's clearly signaled that he has zero interest in doing that because he believes that, as he tweeted out, that the Democratic establishment has it coming to them. So I would expect him to pick somebody who is a somewhat more palatable version of himself.
Jeremy
Michael.
Corbyn.
Norm,
Jeremy
any
Corbyn
thought
is
at this point?
not
Well,
busy.
Attractive governors?
It's really going to be an interesting question whether Bernie, if he wins a nomination, is pragmatic at all. And being pragmatic would mean picking somebody from the more establishment wing of the party, and it could be somebody who has been another candidate here. So I can imagine him picking an Amy Klobuchar, or I can imagine him reaching out to a Stacey Abrams. And remember, you're also talking about somebody who's 77 years old, who had a recent heart attack, who still, and this will be a topic, I think, at the debate tonight, has not provided full health information. And the head of the American College of Cardiology has said there's one figure in particular that measures whether there's significant blockage or damage, which we don't know. But a younger running mate, and especially somebody who has an attraction to a broader range of Democrats, could be a better balance for him if he were the nominee. If he went for an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez type, he can't go for her, she's not age eligible, or for somebody who really does anchor that left wing of the party, then you're going to see a deeper division in the party and I think real problems down ballot.
Michael, again?
Yeah, I think, if in that second eventuality that Norm mentioned, I think that's makes Sanders even more high-risk candidate. I think if we were having an election between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders where there was no incumbent, I think it would be a different dynamic. We've got both of these candidates. Trump 4 years ago, Sanders now raises all sorts of questions on the part of a lot of voters who might not vote for their usual party. I think Trump raises fewer of those questions because the fears that many people had of dictatorship, of concentration camps for journalists and things like that have not come true in the 3 years plus of the Trump administration. And so he's perhaps seen as a less risky alternative, although, second-term presidents sometimes have a certain amount of hubris and are not disciplined by the need to seek re-election. But I think it makes Sanders relatively a higher risk, and a left-wing VP would accentuate that, particularly if it's not a well-known person.
Let me just change gears for a moment and ask whether any of you see a lasting impact of impeachment. Any lasting impact of impeachment?
No.
No?
Not on
Henry?
voters' choices.
No.
It's just, it's going to become routine in American history, perhaps.
Henry?
No, I think it hardened choices, so to that extent, it might have helped Trump very slightly, but I don't think it'll be much talked about in the campaigns in the fall.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we'll see the issues come up again. We'll see more congressional oversight on some of the same or issues around that will be pleasing the Democratic base. Republicans won't like it. I think Henry's right that there's been a sort of slight help for Trump motivation of Trump voters, but I think we're pretty locked in on both sides.
Carlin, I would say, there are a couple of wild cards here as well. One is whether Michael Bloomberg follows through on his pledge to spend $1 billion in the fall, whether he is the nominee or not. And if what we see is Warren and others go after him just as hard as they did in the last debate through the coming weeks, he may rethink that. And he might rethink it a little bit if it's Sanders. If he does spend the $1 billion, a lot of it will go to Senate and House races and gubernatorial races, but also Bloomberg gets under Trump's skin in a way that almost nobody else does, because Bloomberg is what Trump has always wanted to be, a genuine billionaire who made it on his own, who's widely respected in his own city of New York. And Bloomberg has hired a psychologist who specializes in narcissism and a comedian to take that and put it into words that will drive the president batty. But also, Bloomberg has the best computer scientists and engineers who can combat some of the cyber work done by Russians and others in social media. And if he spends it, that gives Democrats a little bit more traction than they would have otherwise. And the other is what the Russians do. When Bernie went to Russia, it's almost a guarantee that everything he did, everything he said, in or out of his hotel room, has been taped. And some of it probably is more embarrassing than the public statements that he made. And so we're likely to see an awful lot of stuff emerge with newer versions of WikiLeaks that could also alter the dynamic of this race.
Speaking of money and billions of dollars, I recommend all of you, Ad Age is doing regular tracking of candidate spending. And yesterday they said that in terms of annual spending, in terms of just looking at what Bloomberg has spent thus far, about $420 million, that puts it on a par with what Heineken spends each year, Kraft Heinz spends, and Hershey, and it puts Bloomberg at number 118 in terms of annualized spending overall. We want to turn to your questions. One quick question, what are you all watching for tonight's debate?
I'm watching to see if someone goes after Bernie Sanders. Obviously, there's a little bit of irony that the last debate, Mike Bloomberg, this candidate who hadn't been on the stage, who is not on the ballot until Super Tuesday, was the subject of attacks, very significant attacks, and Bernie Sanders was left alone. I think Norm's right that there's a risk to that, but we're getting down to crunch time, and we'll see if someone goes much more directly at him.
And the candidate who has really hit Bernie in the last couple of days is Pete Buttigieg. And I expect that will continue. Buttigieg got a big boost with the endorsement of The State, the largest newspaper in South Carolina. Whether those endorsements make any difference, we don't know. But up to now, Bernie has largely been unscathed. Some of it is journalists because he ran the last time. There's this sort of conceit, well, everybody knows that now, and they don't repeat things that they know, but most others don't. But it's very reminiscent of what happened in 2012, where Mitt Romney was running against a bunch of people who wanted to be the anti-Romney. And through all of those early debates, they focused on each other and let him get off unscathed. And now it really is a question of whether, instead of Bloomberg, they begin to take on Sanders. I suspect Elizabeth Warren will still take on Bloomberg more. But I think Biden and Buttigieg are likely to go after Bernie, and how he responds is going to be an interesting question, and how his people respond afterwards.
They'll do to him what Marco Rubio did to Trump late in his campaign. No, I mean, it's fascinating that just like 2016, the multitude of non-interloper candidates have declined to go after the interloper who's been winning pluralities in the early races because they don't want to antagonize his backers. And we're seeing almost exactly the mirror image of it. It's quite fascinating.
Henry, any thoughts about what you're looking at?
There's a number of candidates who would normally have been expected to have dropped out, who have not dropped out. And they have one last chance, or maybe two. I forget, is there another debate before Super Tuesday, or is this the last one?
No, it's 3 days between South Carolina and
Yeah,
Super
well,
Tuesday.
they could have stuck something on Sunday night.
Well, I don't think
Debate
so.
number 10.
Yeah, so this is
Sunday. You don't have debates on Sunday.
So this is the last chance that they've got to break through. This is the last chance for Amy Klobuchar to break through. This is the last chance for Elizabeth Warren to really capitalize on what was a sinking campaign that she helped briefly revive. And I'll be looking to see whether they go big or whether they're planning to go home.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. Norm outlines correctly about Pete Buttigieg. He's the one that's got the biggest problem in South Carolina, which is that he is not, for whatever reasons, attractive at all to black voters who have been 61% of South Carolina Democratic primary voters in the last primary.
That's one thing I just want to throw out is that in the last primary was 61% African-American voters. Most of the surveys that you've been seeing showing Biden with the small lead have samples of African-Americans being between 50 and 55% of the election.
It may be less. South Carolina's had big population gain.
It
and
may
it's
be.
had-
It's
It's had the upscale type people
All I'm
coming
s-
in there that are responsible
That
in
may
part
be.
for the first congressional district going Democratic last time.
That may be. All I'm saying is that if the primary electorate looks this time like it did last time, Biden will win by a much larger margin than the polls, because all of the polls show him winning the African-American vote with somewhere in the low 30s to up to 40% of the vote. And the only reason his lead is in the single digits in most polls is because they have significantly a lower share of African-Americans in the voting pool.
One secondary story, I think we should watch. Tom Steyer will be on the stage again. Tom Steyer is in a way the Michael Bloomberg of South Carolina. He has put all of his resources there, knowing Bloomberg's not there. He is polling in the high teens. He could meet the threshold. Takes away from Biden to some extent. Being on stage there, I don't think he's impressed the world dramatically, but here he is, one last chance to perhaps do something either positively for him or negatively to the other candidates in South Carolina. So I think that's something to watch.
We've covered an enormous amount of ground, and now it's time for all of you who will have the first question. And please identify yourselves and ask a question. Yes, in the front row here. She's coming. Just a sec. Microphones are coming.
Thank you all very much. I'm not quite sure who this question is for. It may actually be for Ms. Baumann, but I identify as being from Wisconsin, an area that was Joe McCarthy's hometown and has been a mix of blue collar and farming, Appleton, Green Bay, the Valley. So you talk about the suburban voters and where they fall in. But there's also a trend in places like Wisconsin and elsewhere for people who lived on the farm to move to the county seat, which is not the same as moving to a Philadelphia or a Loudoun suburb, but is a movement from rural to urban or suburban. So my question is, do any of you see any movements in what happens with those kind of voters who are going from rural to not rural?
I think they've been voting. I think they've continued to vote like rural, small-town people. I mean, one of the interesting, if you look at precinct maps of presidential elections the last 20 years, Democrats did very well in western Wisconsin and those relatively rural and small-town counties in the Mississippi Valley, beautiful area scenery-wise, and in eastern Iowa. And that changed with the 2016 election, in which those areas moved toward Donald Trump. So I don't see a significant difference whether you live on a farm or you live in the courthouse town.
Well, Wisconsin is different from Pennsylvania and Michigan. The suburban voters, first of all, around Milwaukee are more conservative than the ones in, say, Bucks County. But also, as it has urbanized, it's been the kind of urbanization that you're talking about. And Wisconsin, I think, is a heavier lift for Democrats this next time than Pennsylvania or Michigan. And for Democrats, that means if they can't win Wisconsin, they've got to pick up a state like Arizona or, in a bigger reach, a Georgia. And Arizona's certainly a real possibility, but there too, the identity of the Democratic nominee will matter a lot.
There's an old adage in demography that density equals Democrats. The closer you move to central cities, the more Democratic. Central cities are more Democratic and become less so as you move out. I thought the decision of the Democrats to select Milwaukee as their convention site was a very smart one. In a way, they were looking to their past and not to their future. Their other two choices were Houston and Miami, both minority cities, whereas Wisconsin's about 80% white and Milwaukee's about 60% white. It's a very different demographic in significant ways.
Miami would have been an interesting choice considering Bernie Sanders' comments on the
That is
Castro
certainly
brothers.
true.
Well, I think cities that elected socialist congressmen and socialist mayors will be an interesting one for Bernie Sanders.
Milwaukee had socialist mayor for something like 30 years who were considered to be very efficient and honest at a time when not all civic leaders, even in a city 90 miles south of Milwaukee, were so reputed.
Other questions? Right here in the front. Again, another question in the front. The microphone's coming your way. It's right in the front, Valerie, right.
Yeah. It's an obstacle course to get there. Getting your steps in.
My name's Larry Hirschman, and I just have a quick question. If Bernie Sanders gets the nomination, do you think he will moderate any of his positions in order to have a broader appeal during the election?
No.
No.
Any others?
His earlier writings on, how shall I say this, personal themes, he may want to change slightly at age 78.
This question in the front.
Thank you, Larry Checo. I'm surprised we haven't heard about the Electoral College versus popular vote this morning. Could somebody give a little insight into how that might break down this time around?
Well, you certainly will, and we'll have a special event for John Fortier's book going forward. But John, you're the expert.
Sure. Well, one thing I wanted to follow up on something Norm said, again, unlikely, but there are scenarios where we have the 269 tie. Norm pointed to the 2nd District of Maine. Actually, Donald Trump won that by nearly 10 points. The Nebraska district, Nebraska is the other state that is actually a closer possibility that if Democrats were to somehow win that state, that district, as Obama would, that would break a tie as well. Look, we don't know that the election is going to play on the same turf, but I think likely we'll see those 3 Midwestern states as key. And if you remember, those 3 were one was necessary to put Donald Trump over the top. Could one balance this out with an Arizona? I'm a little more skeptical. Arizona, while I think is probably moving the Democratic direction, was still a 3.5 point win for Donald Trump. That's a pretty good distance to move. But it's if you're looking for other states, that's one that might be on the map. Certainly, Trump himself lost some states by a small margin. They weren't the biggest states, but New Hampshire being very, very close, Minnesota being just 1.5 points, Nevada, Maine. So, I do think there's possibility for a new map, but, all things as they stand now, I think we probably are looking, especially with the, Bernie Sanders nomination, looking at how these voters that turn those Midwestern states would react to a Sanders candidacy. In some ways, he has the same voter profile. He's looking at some of the same non-college whites, but it's not clear how that's going to play out. So, I don't expect too much difference, but that's a possibility. The other thing on a tie is that you do have to have a majority of delegations in the House. Republicans actually, being in the minority, control a very small majority, 26 delegations. You actually need an absolute majority, so 25 won't do it. And that's where we get into the later chapters of after the people vote into the vice presidency or perhaps the line of succession going forward. But that would be good for the book and bad for the country.
Which is where
the Democratic candidate campaign manager should be aware that the Electoral College will determine the outcome of this election. Whether the counterpart in 2016 was fully aware is not clear. No, I mean, look, Electoral College and the single-member equal population district give a disadvantage to a party whose support, who gets a large percentage of its votes from constituencies where they get 80 to 100% of the vote. That's the Democratic Party today. And we are at a situation where, for the first time in our history, the largest state is at one end of the political spectrum with all those popular votes. If you look at New York from 1820 to 1963 when it was the largest state, or California from 1964 through 2000, 2004 when it's the largest state as it still is, they almost always voted within 5 points of the national average. Those states were seriously contested in close presidential elections time after time, and it's why for 140 years you had all those candidates from New York, because, hey, 47 electoral votes, small margin, and so forth. California last time was the number 2 Democratic state, after 1 point less Democratic than Hawaii. So that gives, outside of California, that gives, advantage. When you look at those national polling results and you see some of these things, Elizabeth Warren, say, 2 points ahead of Donald Trump, that's where Hillary Clinton was after all the votes were counted in 2016. So that's just something that, Democrats are talking about. We're going to change the Constitution. We're going to admit 20 states in the District of Columbia as separate states in the Union. I live in a 225-unit condo. I guess I get a state.
Okay, there's one question over here. And then we're going to go over here and over here.
Hello, I'm Nicole Penn, Program Manager at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm wondering, another thing that hasn't been touched upon in this conversation is age. This is going to be the first election where Gen Z has a perhaps significant voice. How might that play into reception towards Bernie Sanders or, I'm just curious how that might affect your prognostications.
I mean, the 79-year-old would be Bernie Sanders, the 78-year-old Bloomberg, the 77-year-old Biden, the 73-year-old Trump. Yeah.
What, when Bernie ran the last time, I joked that he has suits older than most of his voters. But he clearly excites a younger generation. One thing about the younger generation is that they have tended to vote more Democratic. And that's true for Z and Y and X. It's, I think, a longer-term problem for Republicans. We used to say in political socialization that if you vote for a party 3 times in a row, that's going to determine your identity. The real question is what kind of a turnout you get and where. And Bernie's whole approach is based on the idea that there's an enormous wave of X, Y, and Z voters turning out for him across the country, and that will be enough to overcome whatever the forces working against him will. You've got to be a little bit skeptical about that. Now the question is, as he moves forward, whether those young voters turn out in some of these primaries. It appears in South Carolina, for example, that he's got some support from younger African-American voters. He certainly had it with African-American and Hispanic voters in Nevada, albeit with a very small group. What we've seen with voting patterns in the past has to leave one a little bit skeptical that that's going to be enough if you can't win in Florida, for example, or if you are struggling to get enough of those suburban voters in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, or in suburban Detroit.
Well, you get the age thing, a big age break in UK election last December. The young voters went hugely for the Labour Party of Jeremy Corbyn. Of course, that party lost by the biggest margin since 1987. But, we've seen that for Bernie Sanders. It's also part of the reason I think that he's done well with Hispanics. Nevada entrance poll showed him getting 51% of Hispanics versus 29% of whites and 27% of blacks. Hispanics tend to be lower income, which tends to work for Bernie. They tend to be younger, which seems to be working for Bernie, who interestingly did not have a totally left-wing view on immigration historically, though he toes that line now.
Okay, two more questions. We're going to put both of these on the table, and then anybody can answer them. You first, and then you.
Alex Mayshan, follow me on Twitter. With the failures and embarrassments of the Democratic Party in Iowa and Nevada, what do you guys see as the future of the caucus system and its sort of play in primary election?
Dead and buried.
Dead and buried? Okay, that was easy. Here's the question right here.
Paul Heldman Simpson Partners. Put a lot of themes on the table. I guess I'm asking you to put it all together and answer the question of what is the likelihood, given all the different themes that you've identified, that we end up with a Washington in 2021 in which one chamber of Congress is controlled by a party that isn't the president's, that we have a divided government?
We've had divided government since 1968, 2/3 of the time. And I think it's the consensus, as I listen to Norm and the other panelists, that we're likely to get it. One of the reasons we don't get a lot of legislative compromises and things that many people yearn for is that both parties with a pretty narrowly divided country, both parties think, gee, next time I got a chance to win it all. If you're a Democrat, you're sitting here looking at Trump's job rating. You're looking at the Democratic majority in the House looking fairly good to retain. The possibilities they have of the majority in the Senate being non-trivial and beating Donald Trump. And if you're an optimist, you say, hey, we may win it all next time. And if you're a Republican optimist, you may say, well, Donald Trump, the great economy, he's going to be reelected. The Senate's got at least 54 Republican seats. You know, we're going to win all of our current ones and beat Doug Jones, and we're going to win those 18 seats because Bernie Sanders is going to antagonize all those suburbanite women. Gee, and you're both thinking, gosh, we could win it all.
John.
Look, I think probably there's consensus here, but I believe that probably the House and Senate are going to stay in the same hands, so that would be an easy answer. But also, you look back traditionally, it has been very, very rarely that a sitting president wins re-election or election and brings in a House that they've lost. Harry Truman's the only one that comes to mind. He didn't actually really wasn't reelected. He was a successor, but really almost no president has done that. So you could imagine a big Trump victory for some reason, but it's hard to pull along the same number of seats as it is in a midterm election when you're out. So I think it's very, very likely we'll have divided government no matter who is president.
So we were talking before about the impact of impeachment. Bernie may, if he's the nominee, wash a lot of this stuff away. But you've got some of these Senate seats in Colorado, for example, in Arizona, in Maine, where the Republican senators had some difficulty. They're kind of stuck between sticking with the base and potentially alienating some of the suburban voters who are appalled by a lot of the conduct that they've seen, or voting for witnesses, or even voting for conviction and alienating the base. And they all went all in on the base. Now, will that have an impact on some of the Senate elections? If Bernie is the nominee, I suspect not, because I think then it's a completely different frame for the election. If it's somebody else, then it's at least possible that a Democratic nominee, and if the economy is showing some faltering signs, could win 50 seats in the Senate. So it's possible we could have united government. I think it's unlikely that we'll see united Republican government, but here too, a Sanders candidacy, if he doubles down on the left, if he picks a Tulsi Gabbard as his running mate and basically gives a middle finger to the establishment across the board, that could result in a real bloodbath.
Yeah. I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank the panelists for a wonderful session.
Tulsi.